Welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of May 21st, 2026. Two Georgia and American icons of media and sports died recently, as you probably heard. Media entrepreneur and former Atlanta Braves and Hawks owner Ted Turner died on May 6th at age 87, and former Atlanta Braves manager Bobby Cox died 3 days later on May 9th at age 84. Turner, of course, turned WTCG Channel 17 in Atlanta into Superstation TBS, broadcasting Braves games all across the country as America's team after he bought the Braves in 1975. He also eventually bought the Atlanta Hawks. He won the America's Cup in 1977, founded CNN in 1980, among many other accomplishments. Bobby Cox managed the Braves to 14 consecutive division titles, 5 National League championships, and a World Series title in 1995, which was Atlanta's first before he stepped down in 2010. To put it all in perspective, I invited former Atlanta Journal-Constitution sports columnist Mark Bradley to come back on the podcast to reminisce about these two Georgia legends, and he kindly agreed. Mark covered both of them, particularly Bobby Cox, during his 40-plus year career in journalism, covering the world of sports from 1984 to 2024. Mark came out of retirement the day after Cox's death to write an editorial about him for the AJC on Sunday, May 12th of this year, and you can find that at ajc.com. Mark first came on as a guest on this podcast on July 17th of 2025, and I hope he'll be back many more times, as I think you'll be able to tell. I always enjoy talking to my friend Mark Bradley. My conversation with Mark Bradley begins now. Mark Bradley, welcome back to our podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
You have returned to talk about two Atlanta legends who are now deceased, who died over the past week. We're talking about Ted Turner and Bobby Cox. And I was prompted, I had already thought about talking to you perhaps about Ted Turner, and then I saw your column. You returned to the pages, the E pages, I will point out, of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution to write about Bobby Cox, whom you knew well. And so we're here to talk about these two Atlanta legends and how they sort of reshaped, and your memories of both of them, how they reshaped Atlanta sports, particularly Bobby Cox. I know you knew him personally for all those years that I think he was the skipper. But what do you think about and or remember about Ted Turner and his impact on Atlanta sports?
I didn't know Ted very well at all. I got to Atlanta in 1984. Um, the, and I would see him around. Obviously, he was at Hawks games and Braves games. About the only time I ever remember asking him a question in person was at the when they fired Joe Torre to hire Eddie Haas as manager, a move that will not go down in Braves history as the greatest of all time. But uh, uh,
No.
that's the one time I remember asking him something in person. I did interview him over the phone once because I was doing a story on Walter Banks, the famous Braves usher, who also worked with my wife at Rich's when she came here. He actually knew my wife before he knew me. And long story short, Walter Banks was like the best guy who ever lived, and everybody who knew him, he was the usher in Ted's box down there
Mm.
at various stadiums over the years. And I was doing a story on him, and Ted was very happy to call me back and talk about Walter. He loved Walter just like everybody loved Walter.
Hmm. Um, he famously, of course, purchased WTCG in Atlanta before it was TBS and bought the Atlanta Braves in 1975 in order to fill some programming holes and to put them on there. Did you, before arriving in Atlanta, like everybody else, did you watch the Braves on what
Oh
became
yeah.
TBS?
Yeah, I actually like the Braves a lot because, and I'm supposed to be impartial, but I didn't cover the Braves back in 1980 or 80, but it was in 82 that I first remembered seeing them. That's when we got cable in Lexington, Kentucky, or at least my part of Lexington, Kentucky. And the Braves were on, and not only were they on, they won their first 13 games of the year. And the last few of those games were like must-see TV, at least for me and my wife, then my girlfriend, and we would watch the games, and we became pretty big Braves fans.
Mm-hmm.
And like the whole that whole year, and then the whole next year, I really was. They were kind of my team, my baseball team, and I still remember the night Bob Watson hit a home run uh, off the Dodgers to win a game, a tremendous game between the two teams that were vying for the pennant for a second consecutive year. And although that was the year the Braves didn't hold on and win, they finished second that year. But the Bob Watson game is one of the greatest regular season baseball games I've ever watched.
Back when they were in the National League West.
Yes, they were.
Yes,
Yes, they were.
indeed. Yeah. When did you start covering the Braves for the AJC?
In '84 when I came here.
Okay.
I remember my first assignment. I came here in March, and I had been doing a lot of college basketball because it was tournament time. And then I came off college, but I was a general assignment person then. And I remember that when the Braves, I think they started on the road, but their first homestand was against the Mets, and I remember Gary Caruso, our executive sports editor, said, "Hey, go over the ballpark and write a story about Darryl Strawberry." So I went over the ballpark and wrote a story about Darryl Strawberry, who at that time was like the guy, the coming guy
Mm-hmm.
in Major League Baseball. He was a big deal.
Did you
And
interview him for
but
the
yeah,
story?
I'm sorry, did I
Did you
interview?
interview him for the story? Or
Yeah,
do you
I
just,
did.
yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
the Mets were really good about making him available to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think they had it was an off day, and they were
Mm.
just hitting, and they made him available, um, and yeah, I mean it was fine. And but I ended up doing a lot of Braves that year in my capacity as a GA, a general assignment guy, and I would do some weekends. I would do like the Sunday game story the beat writer could get the day off, and other days I would go and write a sidebar. And I remember yeah, I mean it was yeah, I saw a lot of Braves, and then over the years I got more and more involved, and then when I became a columnist, I mean, I would wrote a lot of columns about the Braves.
Mm-hmm. And who was the first manager that you met
Um,
of the
well, they
Braves?
just Torrey was the first.
Okay.
That was his last year, and they fired him for finishing what, two games under 500 or something, so they
Mm-hmm.
could hire Eddie Haas. Again, not the greatest move ever. Eddie didn't make it through August.
Yeah.
So and then from I don't know if you want to count Bobby Wine, the interim manager that year, but
Right.
then they moved on to Chuck Tanner, who
Mm-hmm.
Turner had hired in one of the curious hires, one of another curious hire in that he hired Chuck Tanner at the same time they hired Bobby Cox. And they were both very successful managers. Cox had just won the AL East with Toronto. Tanner had, as we know, won the World Series with Pittsburgh in 1979. And so they brought them both here, and according to Ted, he said, "Well, I let them pick which job they wanted, GM or coach, or GM or manager. I'm sorry."
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if Tanner got first choice or Cox got first choice, but Cox was the GM for the first for from 1985 through June of 1990. And I really got a chance to know him then because he was, he wasn't in the dugout. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but he liked talking baseball. And a lot of times when I would go to a game, they were pretty terrible then, so the games really didn't matter much. So I would go knock on the door of the manager's of the GM's little booth upstairs, and he would let me come in and we'd talk for a couple of innings. Sometimes Stan Kasten was in there. He was president of the Braves then. Other times it was just Bobby and me, and we got to know each other pretty well back then.
Hmm. Um, and in probably his most, now you can correct me, check me on this if you will, but in 1987, one of his most famous, long lasting moves as general manager was making a trade with the Detroit Tigers.
Right. That
Uh,
was
Tell us
and
about
yeah,
that.
for Doyle Alexander. Yeah, that was actually the trade that sort of benefited both teams. Because Detroit was trying to hold on and win the AL East that year, and they did. And they traded for Alexander, and Alexander was really good for them, and they
Mm-hmm.
might not have won the East if not for
Mm-hmm.
getting him. But it came at a cost, as sometimes things do. And they traded John Smoltz to the Braves, and the Braves ended up getting a Hall of Fame pitcher out of it. So long term, there's no question who won that trade,
Yeah.
because Alexander wasn't in baseball much longer. He was a veteran, but that was
Mm-hmm.
that was the perfect trade for the Atlanta Braves at that time.
And Smoltz was unknown, right? I mean, he was a minor leaguer at that time.
I mean, he was a minor leaguer. He was considered a good prospect. I
Yeah.
don't know that he
Yeah.
was a prospect on the order of Steven Strasburg, but people knew who he was in
Mm-hmm.
baseball.
Mm-hmm.
And Cox got good value for what was then a very good major league pitcher. And but the guy he got ended up being a very good major league pitcher for about the next 20 years. So
Yeah. Hall of Famer.
yeah,
Did he also draft Tom Glavine?
he did.
Mm-hmm.
He was general manager when they drafted Glavine and
Mm-hmm.
Avery and Steve Avery
Mm-hmm.
and again that he also drafted Chipper Jones, even though that at the time seemed like that was the Braves being unlucky because the number one pick in the draft basically said he didn't want to he was not going to play. He was not going to come out that year. He was going to go to college. And uh, the famous pitcher and a famous pitcher who never did very much in the major leagues.
Mm-hmm.
And the Braves sort of fell into Chipper because he was like considered they had the number one pick overall, and the guy who would have been the number one pick said, "No, I'm not coming." Although he did end up, as it turned out, he ended up with the Angels, not the Angels, with the A's because he had said he had wanted to end up on a winning team, and he he had sort of talked his way into what he thought would be an advantageous situation because he didn't want to go to a bad team, and the A's were then the dominant team in baseball.
Mm-hmm.
So, but Chipper Jones came to the Braves. That worked out pretty well too. Another Hall of Famer. So,
Sure did.
if he was the consolation prize, he was a really good consolation prize.
Now, Bobby Cox had had a previous tenure as Braves manager, and
Yeah,
as you
yeah.
mentioned, and was fired. And then maybe you can tell the story. Ted Turner, when they he fired him, they said, "Well, who are you looking for as a manager?"
Well, I wasn't at that press conference, but it's a
Yeah.
pretty famous press conference because Ted's answer was, "Well, if I hadn't just fired Bobby Cox, I'd be looking for a guy like Bobby Cox." So. I mean, it was one of those things and to be fair, the Braves did hire Joe Torre, and the
Yeah.
Joe Torre they did have their first winning season in a very long time,
Mm-hmm.
and they did win the NLE, well, NL West, sorry,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in 1982, and came very close in 1983. So that kind of put the Braves back on the map for a little while, and
Mm-hmm.
then they completely dropped off the map for the rest of the decade because they were just terrible. But Cox had built the team that was going to get better, that you would think. And he had David Justice, he had Ron Gant, they were still kind of anchored around Dale Murphy, but and who was fading, beginning to fade at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But they were you could kind of see, and they had all the young pitchers, Pete Smith, Steve Avery, Smoltz, Glavine. and they were kind of coming, and but they didn't arrive until Cox went back down to the dugout, which came in 1990 in June. Russ Nixon had been hired to replace Tanner when they fired Tanner in 1988, uh, because Cox fired Tanner because he didn't like the way Tanner was handling the young pitching. That was basically the only reason that anybody had great uh, uh, the only reason that um, anybody had could see a bright future for the Braves was if the young pitching worked out, and Cox didn't like the way Tanner was handling that. And so Cox fired Tanner, hired Russ Nixon, moved him up in the farm system. And Russ was Russ was I liked Russ Nixon a lot. And he was a really good guy, but he was so blunt, and he wasn't exactly the kind of guy that you would want um, in charge of rookies and young guys who were going to make mistakes. He was a very blunt spoken person, and it was he said he was a great interview because you would ask him something and it would be totally honest in a way that not many managers were. Um, I remember that they were playing a doubleheader against the Braves. I'm sorry, a doubleheader against the Reds, back when they actually had such things as doubleheaders. And the Reds put out their A team in the first game and won, and then they put out pretty much their B team in the second game. And Russ came out and saw the lineup card in the dugout, and in trying to inspire his team, he said, "Hey, that ain't a very good team over there." And one of his players looked at him and said, "Which one?" So, and then another game. I'm sorry to get off on tangents here, but
No, please.
this is my last Russ Nixon
I was going to
tangent.
ask you for some Russ Nixon stories.
Oh, were you? Yeah, he was
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
I really liked. I'd gotten to know him a little bit in Cincinnati because he had managed the Reds while I
Mm-hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
in Lexington and covering the Reds on
Yep.
occasion.
Mm-hmm.
And we got along too. Anyway, but the other one I remember was they were playing. They had a game. They're playing the Padres, I think, and they were ahead. Believe it or not, they were actually ahead. This was at a time where they didn't lead very many games, and Jack Clark came up and hit like a three-run, a grand slam homer to make the game close again. That went about 500 feet, and uh, and then he came up in the next inning and hit one that might have gone 900 feet. I'm exaggerating, yes, but they were
Sure.
just monster shots.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Russ, somebody asked Russ about Jack Clark after the game, which the Padres won, coming from like
Mm-hmm.
7 runs behind because Jack Clark hit 2 home runs. And they asked him about his home runs, and Russ said, "Well, I didn't think Fulton County was gonna could um, I didn't think Fulton County would hold the second one, and I'm not talking about the ballpark." At that time, it was
Yeah.
Atlanta Fulton County
Right.
Stadium.
Atlanta Fulton
So
County Stadium. Yeah.
he
Yeah.
was he was a beauty. Okay, well,
Yeah.
back to Bobby. Um, in June, the Braves were not doing well under Russ, and the thinking upstairs by Caston was that the Braves needed a gentler hand, and so Caston convinced Bobby to go back downstairs, to stop being general manager and become the manager. And I'll remember this weekend for as long as I live because the on the Friday, Bobby was the day that they did the firing, and Bobby came out. Bobby was his manager, introduced his manager, and I walk in, and he just looks right in a uniform again in his office. You think, okay, this is where he should be. He looks he never quite looked he didn't look awful or anything, but he just never looked kind of he didn't you thought of him still more as a manager than a GM. And um he would wear sweater vests and not suits or for the most part. And it was anyway, so he just looked like this was a guy back in his element again on that Friday. And then the game got rained out, so they didn't play. And then on Saturday, Russ Nixon gave a statement to I think one of the TV stations on his farm. He lived outside the area. I think it was over in Covington. And he said something about he thought he managed really well and that the Braves were just, I'm quoting him here, a damn soap opera down there with TBS and everything, the TV station.
Hmm.
So on the Monday, I had gone to the game on Sunday. They actually came from behind. It was I think Cox's first win, I think. Andres Thomas, if you remember him, got the winning
Hmm.
hit, the shortstop.
Wow.
And then on Monday, I had called Terry McGurk, who then as now was a key guy in the Braves organization, and I wanted to ask, and he was the biggest conduit to TBS, and I was trying to set up an interview with him um, to come ask about what Russ Nixon has said, like. And I was going to go up basically ask him, "Are you a soap opera?" And then I got the little beep on call waiting on the phone. This is back in the days of non-mobile phones,
Hmm.
and I and it was my wife saying, "We got to go to the emergency. We got to go to the hospital. My water just broke."
Oh boy.
And
Yeah.
and I said, "It's not even the right month." She was due in like this was the end of June, and she was due in July. And she said, "I don't care. We got to go to the hospital." So I had to call McGurk. I had to get back on with McGurk and say I think it was with his office. It wasn't with him. It was with his secretary, and I said, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to make it down there today. I have to go. Our baby's coming." And so I remember that day. It's June 25th. Rachel Bradley was
Mm.
born,
Hmm.
and I was still. And I remember while we were in the hospital on the 26th and 27th, we would watch the Braves game, the three of us, on TV. So
And
sorry,
presumably you never got to ask.
that's a
No, no,
long,
no.
long way to get around to Bobby Cox.
No, not at all. And so you never got a chance to ask about the soap opera.
I don't think I ever did actually. I've since talked with Terry McGurk, but
Yeah.
several times, but no, I don't know that I ever wrote that one. But anyway,
So, and by the way, this is talk about, okay, what was the name of the manager of the Cincinnati Reds there in the late 80s when they were doing so well with Barry Larkin as their shortstop? Lou
Panella,
Pinella. Thank you. I
yeah,
couldn't remember his last name.
yeah,
I remember that right. I think that he was a manager in that period when
he
they
was
were
the
doing
manager
well.
on the team that won in 1990. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Um, so Bobby Cox becomes manager in June of 1990. The team is finishes in last place, and he's manager for the next 20 plus seasons. He's there for a very
yeah,
long time, till 2010, the end of that season.
yeah.
And we know about the success. So, talk to us a little bit about, because I mean, we all saw, like me, from afar. You could watch Bobby Cox, and it's interesting that you say he had a gentler hand, because from where I sat, he always seemed like a baseball lifer. You know, he wore the spikes. He seemed like he was old school, having played for the Yankees, having come up and managed under Billy Martin. That he was kind of a tough old bird. But you describe him as a
He
gentle hand.
was, but he wasn't. And I've been around a lot of. Well, I was around a lot of managers, and some of them really were tough old birds.
Hmm.
But Bobby was had a gentler hand, to use that
Yeah.
word again,
Hmm.
especially with his players.
Yeah.
And he was not. I mean, he this sounds really gushy and kind of stupid, uh, in the sense it's saying that everybody who ever played for him loved him. Because maybe might have been a couple of them that didn't. But they would have been in the 1 percentile. Those people who didn't get along with Bobby Cox, because if you couldn't get along with him, you couldn't get along with anybody.
Mm.
Because he really treated everybody like they were the most important person in the world to him, and that they were his team, his players, and that he wanted nothing more than for them to succeed and to have a wonderful life. Because that's and that's not always the case with every manager. I mean, there
Mm.
are crusty managers. There are, but how many times did you hear a Brave say something bad about Bobby Cox, or even an ex-Brave say something bad about Bobby Cox? Because it just didn't happen.
Hmm.
They, um, they, and the other thing too is the man won. I mean, let's look at it. Okay, so he goes to Toronto, and in 3 years there, he does what's never been done. He wins the division with an expansion team in 1985. They had not been around for very long. First time to the playoffs, 1985. He leaves there to take the GM job down here. So he doesn't manage from 1986 through 1989. He takes over in the middle of 90 when the Braves were already terrible. And then for the next 14 completed seasons, every team Bobby Cox came north with from uh, from spring training won the division. And if you tack on the one with the 1 year with Toronto, which he would always find a sly way of reminding you, we talk about, hey, you won 8 in a row, and he said you won 8 division titles, and he goes, actually, I've got 9. He
Yeah.
likes saying that,
Hmm.
but so over, because we don't count 94 because its season didn't end. There was
Hmm.
no.
The infamous
Uh,
strike, right? That killed the season.
yeah.
Hmm.
So, and but over 15 completed seasons, every team he brought north from spring training won the division. And this was at a time where you had to win the division to get into the postseason. I mean,
Yep.
it didn't matter who you gave him. And granted, John Sherholtz gave him big time players, and every year. And I mean, the Braves were very, very talented. They had the greatest pitching rotation probably ever. And Chipper Jones, great player. Uh, David Justice, really good player. Fred McGriff, really good player. Great Sherholtz trade there.
Hmm.
Uh, but I mean, but once they got it going, they they went. I mean, they did not have a down year. They had, their down years were not winning the World Series, basically.
Right. Yep.
And I know that Cox is criticized in some circles, and it's a fact. They've only won one World Series out of those all those division titles. But, as Cox has said to me once, sitting in his farmhouse up in Adairsville, we played better in 3 of the World Series we didn't win than we did in the one we did.
Hmm.
And that's true. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, they didn't hit much at all against Cleveland. Their pitching just shut down Cleveland.
Yeah.
And they played. I mean, the series, the 91, 92, and 96 World Series could have easily have gone the other way, and probably should have. If Lonnie Smith doesn't stop at second base,
Oh
if
man.
Ed Sprague doesn't hit a home run in the ninth inning that turns around game two in 1992, if Jim Leyritz doesn't do what he does in game four of 1996, you'd be
Yeah.
looking at those Braves as a dynasty without question.
Yeah.
But within baseball, they were a dynasty.
Yeah.
because I mean, because so many, everybody in baseball, all the front office people, all the managers, the players, they tended to look on what you did over the regular season as the real measure.
Hmm.
Because, postseason could get weird, as we knew. And it began to get really weird when they brought in the wild card,
Yeah, I was about to say
which
that.
which
Yep.
happened in 95 was the first wild card year.
Yep.
And but that's so I heard it so many times from so many people, on other teams that they would ask me, like, okay, you see this team, how do they do this every year? And, first reason, Bobby Cox. Second reason,
Hmm.
John Schuerholz. I
Hmm.
mean, third reason, I mean, great pitching. But I mean,
Yeah.
they, it was, this was not your ordinary manager.
Hmm.
This was one of the great managers of all time, without question.
Yeah. And I want to get into the nuts and bolts of some of that and what that means and what you saw up close with him. And when I hear that they only won one World Series, I'm all, of course we know, particularly back then, there were, as you mentioned, there were only four teams in the playoffs. So there were only four
That's correct.
baseball teams that went to the postseason. And, only one team can win the championship. That's true in any
There is
sport.
that.
And so the idea that, and I always ask people, well, how many World Series in those years did the Mets or the Cubs win?
Yeah.
Zero. And so, the idea, and winning the National League pennant did mean something, I think, in those days. It meant something to have five of
Well,
those when
I think it still means something. I mean, it
it
means
absolutely does. And,
can't get to the World Series if you don't. So,
and
yeah.
considering where Atlanta had been, right? The Loserville, the whole thing,
Oh,
losing a
yeah.
hundred and something games. And one thing, just to go back for a minute, Ted Turner, I well remember the 1977 season. I remember losing 17 in a row that year. And I remember the night he took over. I was watching on TBS that he took over as manager of the team until he was told by Bowie Kuhn that he couldn't do that. But
Yeah.
um and I was reminded in something I read last week. This is a sideline, Mark. I'm sorry, but in that game, this is how baseball has also changed. Ted said he never got a chance to go out to the mound because Phil Necro pitched a complete game, which was a 2-1 loss. Nobody does that
Yeah.
anymore. Nobody
Yeah.
does that anymore at all.
Yeah. There aren't many
So
of those.
yeah, no. So you and I talked yesterday by phone, and you were talking to me about the loyalty that Bobby Cox had toward his players, and never saying anything bad about that. Talk about that a little bit about his sense of, and
Well,
where do you think that came from?
I just think he was a good guy. I mean, I mean, he came from Northern California. He wasn't a city guy, but he wasn't, like, he it wasn't like he was Zeke from Cabin Creek either. I mean, he had there was a he played ball in New York.
Mm-hmm.
He played for the Yankees, so he had been around, and he had been you were in the Yankees organization. That was a pretty big deal
Yeah.
at the time, even though they were starting to go into their down years.
Mm-hmm.
He told me once that one of his great thrills in life was he was taking a cab to Yankee Stadium, and a guy rides by on a bike. They're stopped at a stoplight, and the guy looks in and says, "Hey, you're Bobby Cox." And the guy was Joe Namath.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I thought that's a pretty
That
good one.
that is pretty good.
Yeah.
And he played with
But
Mantle,
anyway,
did he not? He
but
was on
no,
the team with Mantle.
he just, he learned from everybody around him. He learned from Ralph Houck. He learned from he learned, I'm sure, like you said, you mentioned Billy Martin. Well, Billy Martin was, he was not a guy that every one of his players loved. In fact, he
No.
called a few of them.
Yeah.
The famous one was when he and Reggie Jackson almost got into it in the dugout.
Right.
Uh, but
Fist fight.
um, but Bobby was smart enough to know what worked and what didn't work, and it sounds so simplistic, but the first thing the players like is they want the manager to be for them. They want, and you heard that the TBS microphones would pick it up, obviously. You'd hear him like chattering, "Come on, Jep, come on. uh,
Yep.
Rafi, from the
Mm-hmm.
dugout, and
Mm-hmm.
that was him. He just wanted them to do well, and I mean, obviously, he had a vested interest in them doing well. I mean, that helped him stay employed,
Mm-hmm.
he was just nobody. I mean, so many people, so many great players, so many successful players. I mean, they kind of looked upon Bobby with a sort of awe. It actually went, I think, a little bit beyond just respect. I think it was almost like, he's almost too good to be real because he's just, he's really great to play for.
And you still hear current players, and particularly the current manager, Walt Weiss, talk about the Braves way, the culture that was started under.
Sure.
How would you describe that culture started under Bobby Cox?
Well, you know, I think that they got into it where they just started winning and they kind of didn't they were very particular in what they wanted. And if they found a guy who they brought, sometimes they would bring in a guy who didn't necessarily fit what they were doing, who was more of a loner or a me first guy and that guy didn't last very long. And because they didn't make a big deal out of it. There weren't too many blow-ups over the years with the Braves. Over those 20 years of Cox, but it was one of those things that if they found a guy who didn't necessarily fit in, they 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 didn't feel obliged to keep him around any longer than they had to.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some one-year guys here who were pretty big names, but Kenny Lofton would be one, just to
I was
say.
going to throw his name out and see what you said
Yeah,
about him.
but
And why didn't that work?
I don't know. I don't know. He was an odd guy. I mean,
Was he?
I'm not to say a bad guy, but he was just an
Yeah.
odd guy. And
Mm.
and some, I'm an odd guy, so I couldn't have played for Bobby Cox.
Well, Kenny was on that '95 Cleveland team, right? He was a center
Yes, he
fielder
was.
and he
Yes,
wound
he
up
was.
playing for the Braves. And from the outside looking in, he seemed to be a great player. He seemed to be something they
Oh,
needed.
he was an excellent player. I mean, he
Hmm.
was he was Cleveland's best player by far in that World Series. He was the guy they worried about. It wasn't Albert Bell or even Manny or Tomey. It was Kenny Lofton was the guy the Braves worried about, and that's one of the reasons they got him because they thought he
Hmm.
was a really good player. He just
Hmm.
didn't fit here,
Yeah.
and uh, and they and when you're winning 14 in a row, it's like you kind of trust your instincts because it's you know we're what did we there aren't many times where you have to ask yourself, okay, what did we do? Where did we go wrong? Because they didn't go wrong.
Yeah.
It just it it was so funny with Sherholtz, or at least it's funny to me, that I mean he gets here, they hire him in October of 91, 90 from Kansas City. That's a casting hire and a great one, and to fill the job that Bobby had vacated, so Bobby can stay the field manager. And I mean, they had great respect for each other. I mean, and Sherholz was very different from Bobby. John was not as nearly as effusive in his enthusiasm. He was a very exact speaker, and his appearance. He didn't wear sweater vests. He wore
No.
suits with suspenders
Very
uh,
buttoned down.
and and ties. And he was a front office guy. He had not been a player, and he'd been an English teacher, I believe, before he got on with the Orioles. And but it was funny because their first contact was when Bobby was in the Yankee organization, and the Orioles were in like postseason and stuff, and they wanted Bobby to go over and um, scout the World Series, scout the Orioles and see what the Orioles were doing. and the person that he actually that like met him when he got to the ballpark on the scouting expedition was John Schuerholz, who was in charge of he wasn't the GM in Baltimore then. He was
Hmm.
basically a guy doing a lot of a down the chain guy doing a lot of different jobs, and Bobby said that. Um, what do I do? He'd never been on a scouting trip before, and Bobby said, "So what do I do when I get there?" And the Yankee guy told him, just talk to John Schuerholz. He'll take care of everything. And they met and they bonded really, really well for a long, long time.
Hmm. Do you think Bobby's approach to managing had something to do with his own not so stellar career as a player? Does that affect
Might have,
managers?
might
Yeah.
have, and there's some thought that because he was around guys like Mickey Mantle,
Yep.
and and the sometimes that it's often said that great players don't make great managers,
Hmm.
and I would say that's probably true. Um, I I think a lot of great players don't understand why other players can't be as great as they were. Because a lot of what greatness is about is natural ability, and there's application obviously, but not everybody could be uh, Mike Trout. Not everybody could be Hank Aaron.
Hmm.
uh, Days. So it's I think that was part of it, yeah. And I think that Cox was he just saw what worked and didn't work,
Hmm.
and he wasn't a guy that was going to be the life of many parties or be the loudest talker in the room, but he could really pay attention, and he was very shrewd in his way.
I've heard several interviews since his death, and you keep hearing one phrase over and over again. He was a player's manager. To those of us uninitiated and
Oh, no
outside,
doubt about that.
what does
There's
that
no doubt
mean?
about it.
What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, if you're not a player's manager, you're not going to last very long because the players play the game. I
Hmm.
mean, you can be the world's greatest tactician, and if your players don't want to play for you, then that's not going to you're going to end up in fourth place. I think that what it meant is that his players liked him and performed for him, and that's basically the secret. The the line from Stan Kasten is, I think, probably the best line anybody ever said, and it was this was when I was doing a Bobby story back when they had only won like nine in a row or something like that going into the world. I think it was going into the '99 World Series. And it was just like, how does Bobby Cox keep winning? And I asked Stan, how does Bobby Cox keep winning? And he said, well, the first thing you got to ask when you're hiring a manager is, can he lead men? And well, yeah, this one could. This one did. And I think that I think that that's, all you have to do is look at it again. 14 consecutive first place finishes at a time where you had to finish first, or at least a time where over what some of that you had to finish first. And I think that I mean it's just unremarkable. It's just not, no, it's not. It is remarkable. It is not
Hmm.
unremarkable. It's unbelievable that they did that, and that's the thing that all the people in baseball just just could not get over. 14 in a row.
Hmm.
Dodgers, great team now, spending billions and trillions of dollars. They now have won two consecutive World Series. Um, but the Dodgers aren't going to win 14 in a row. They have a
Right.
ways to go to get to 14 in a row
Yep.
because they finished second one year to the Giants, you'll recall.
Yeah, I do recall.
And that, yeah,
Yeah.
and in fact, I think the Braves won the World Series that year.
I think they
But,
did.
but,
So, what is the opposite of a player's manager, Mark? How would you describe what words describe that person?
well,
And
I I know that there was a guy. I don't think, I don't think. the iron fist works very good in baseball because you're around guys so much. Maybe it works in football,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but in baseball you're together for so long. You start in mid-February, and if you're lucky, you go into November. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if you don't like the guy you're playing for, that's going to have an effect at some point. And I just think that um, I know there have been some kind of guys that were known as like uh, real hard driving guys, and they don't last very long in baseball
Mm-hmm.
because the manager that just doesn't play well over 6 months, over 162 games, a 6 month season, year after year, because guys just get tired of it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I don't know. A lot of talented teams never get off the ground because they don't seem to like playing with each other very much.
Mm-hmm.
And baseball's is very much an individual sport. One guy throws the ball, one guy tries to hit it.
Mm-hmm.
But it, you're still together so long and on the road, in the plane, on the plane, just if you don't get along at least to a certain degree, it, it's it's gonna take its toll.
And I'm going to put you on the spot, and you can say, not answering that question, but is there a manager not currently managing that you would describe by name as that way? And if you don't
Um,
want to, you don't have to.
I remember there was one guy, Vern Rapp was his name,
Mm-hmm.
and he had the reputation of being a real hard driving guy. He was the guy that succeeded Russ Nixon in Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't last long because they ended up bringing back Pete Rose as a manager, uh, to as a player manager.
Yep.
But Vern Rapp is the guy that succeeded Russ Nixon and was succeeded himself by Pete Rose, both of whom were graduates of Western Hills High School in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that you have to be able to do, if you're a manager, of course, is the things you mentioned about Chuck Tanner. You have to be able to manage pitchers. You have to know when to pull somebody. You know when to give
I
somebody
don't
in.
think Tanner was a bad manager,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but I don't think he was right necessarily for the young guys that the
Right.
Braves had.
Yeah, yeah.
And there was a game where Glavine was allowed to take a pretty frightful beating, the young Glavine. Um, and that was kind of the tipping point for Cox. He
Mm-hmm.
said, "You got to get him out of there. You need to spare him this. He's not going to, nothing good can happen from him staying in as long as he did."
Yep.
And that was it was that led to the weekend that led to one of the strangest weekends in Atlanta sports history when on a Sunday in May the Hawks lost the famous Game 7 to Boston, the Larry Bird Dominique Wilkins shootout game,
Mm-hmm.
and later that night the Braves fired their manager. And they both
Yeah.
were owned by the same guy. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
Caston was the general manager of both teams, or he was the president of both teams. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you have to your point earlier. I mean, no matter how you handle your players, you have to be making good decisions about the lineup, and you have to know when to
Well, you do.
substitute, and all those things that Bobby Cox just seemed to be able to do.
Well, and he, I know there was a time that I questioned him when they had it was in the '98 playoffs against San Diego, and they were down 2-0, and they went with their left-hander facing a left-hander uh, lineup and went with Eddie Perez catching because he was Maddox's catcher,
Mm-hmm.
and not Javi Lopez not catching because he wasn't Maddox's catcher, and it was like, they went out to San Diego. They're down 2-0 already. They're facing the Padres who are going crazy. That's the Hell's Bells
Yeah.
Trevor Hitchcock. Yeah,
Hoffman.
yeah, Hoffman. Yeah, and I
Hmm.
said sorry, Hitchcock. It was
Hmm.
Sterling Hitchcock who beat him that day, the
Hmm.
left-handed pitcher.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and I thought, you could have maybe gotten somebody else in there. You could have maybe let
Yeah.
one of your lefties take a swing there. But it was something he had done all year, and he thought he should do it. So,
Hmm.
and you got to have principles too, I guess. And that was, you don't want to look like you're panicking. Although they did lose and fall behind 3-0. Although
Hmm.
they did come back to make it 3-2, if you remember, and send it
Hmm. Oh, I
back to
do.
Atlanta.
Yep.
And then Hitchcock beat him again. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I've heard Freddie Freeman talk about, things he does because he's still, the Bobby Cox way. Don't wear the hat backwards. Where you got your sunglasses and all that. Can you speak to any of that?
Yeah. Yeah, and again, the no music in the clubhouse was a big
Yeah.
thing with him
Yeah.
because he said that all it does will lead to disputes over whose music is going to play and what kind of music are we going to have.
Hmm.
And he said, I just want them to think about baseball. And you kind of had to be around other clubhouses to see because you go into somebody else's clubhouse and they'd be yelling at each other, and music would be blaring, and it would be, you know, it, you think, well, it seems like kind of fun in here, but remember, this is their workplace, 162 games a year, six
Hmm.
months of the full season, and
Hmm.
you know, that was the other thing about Bobby. He was a professional guy. I mean, you put on the uniform, you're supposed to act a certain way. You act like you're a pro. And you're not a kid anymore. You are a major league ball player.
Hmm. Why did he wear the spikes? Do you know?
I don't know. No, I don't know. I guess it's what he liked. I mean, he
Hmm.
he had his habits, and they were very strong habits. I mean, he would get the ballpark 6 hours early, so he just loved being around the ballpark.
Yeah.
And uh, and he didn't. There were times he didn't. He'd spend hours in his little. They had a little room right off the dugout that had different. It had a couple TVs in there, and one of them was always on the Weather Channel because he was a guy who watched the weather constantly. I mean, he would like, okay, is it going to rain at 7 o'clock tonight? Or am I going to have to think about two pitchers tonight? I mean,
Mm.
but he watched the weather. He was a detailed guy.
So I have to ask you about this because it's one of the most famous incidents, if you will, in Braves and Bobby Cox lore. And that is, of course, Andrew Jones, who is about to go into the Hall of Fame. But famously, of course, Bobby Cox pulled him out of center field in the middle of an inning, ran somebody out there when he felt like he didn't hustle. How did that? And maybe you know, maybe you don't know. I don't know. But Andrew Jones, I mean, I've never really heard him talk about it other than describing what happened. But did he learn from that? Did he understand where Bobby was coming from on that? And because it's one of the most infamous moments, if you
Well,
will.
and Andrew was so good, so young.
Yep.
Obviously, hitting 2 home runs as a teenager in the World Series or whatever
Mm-hmm.
it was.
Mm-hmm.
And but I you know, I don't know if Andrew ever got to the point where he loved what happened, but I'm pretty sure it got his attention. And that and again, that's the thing. You're a professional. Give a professional effort.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't just be, you just because you're one of the great talents in baseball, which he clearly was, which is why he's going to the Hall of Fame. But uh, you need to play hard for your teammates. And I think that's the one thing that the Braves did really, really well too. Or not one thing, but that is a thing that the Braves did is they played hard for each other, and they you know they and that was something else that came from a manager that you're not just playing for me, you're playing for these other guys too, and you're playing
Mm-hmm.
for the Atlanta Braves.
And remind me, but didn't Brian Snitker do a similar thing to Ronald Acuna for not running out a long fly ball? He got to wherever he
Believe he
was
did.
and he
Believe he
substituted him.
did.
Yeah,
Believe he did.
yeah, yeah. He learned
Yes,
that
I
from,
believe.
yeah,
Well, he knew Bobby Cox as well as anybody ever did.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
I mean, there were there were so much alike in in their ways, and that's because Brian Snitker had watched Bobby Cox the way Bobby Cox had watched others, and
Hmm.
Snitker had a pretty good idea what worked and how players wanted to be treated.
Hmm. Several players said, and I heard this over the past week. I'm sure you did. You probably witnessed it firsthand. Players said, he was more than a manager. He was like a father to me.
Yeah, I don't know that he was. I don't know that he was ever intrusive, but I think that he just had a manner about him where people knew that he had their best interests at heart, which you would like to think that your parents would. And I can see that young guys coming up and they got a guy here who he could be yelling at him for making an error, but he also could understand what it's like to be a major league player and what how it's not always easy to deal with the stresses and the inherent failures of being a baseball player. I mean, if even a good player fails to get a hit 7 out of 10 times,
Hmm.
not every even Greg Maddux loses a game, although not many. But I he was I know I'm just waxing on, and I'm sorry if
No, no,
this
no, not at all.
repeat
That's why we're here.
so I can repeat myself. Well, thanks. But anyway, no, I think that I think that it's just he was there's a reason he's in the Hall of Fame.
Hmm.
He wasn't a garden variety manager. He was to use the Jose Mourinho description of himself. He was the special one.
Hmm.
And I remember I spent much of a day around Tony La Russa when he was in town, autographing his book and then having a game at the ballpark that night. And La Russa and I talked, and he goes, um, there's nobody I respect more than Cox.
Mm.
And then he goes to the ballpark that night and he gets mad because the umpires aren't giving him the same pitches that Cox gets for his guys, and he gets thrown out of the game. I always
Uh-huh.
thought that was very funny. So,
Well, speaking of
but
that, what
oh,
can you tell us?
Bobby could get
Yeah.
thrown out.
Yeah.
It's
Did you ever
interesting
talk to him
because
about that?
many times,
Hmm.
and I even talked to his wife. Remember calling interviewing Pam once and saying, does he yell all the time around the house? No, he doesn't do
That's
that.
sort of what I was getting
But
at when I asked you that
I
question
think
earlier.
what it was, and it seemed to get worse over time.
Hmm.
He didn't get thrown out quite as much in the early years as he
No.
did in the later years. Some of that I think is just a truism that I've heard other coaches, managers talk about. I know Vince Dooley told me that, it doesn't, he said, the older you get, the less winning feels good and the more losing feels bad.
Hmm.
You just dread the losses. And
Yeah.
and I think that, and how do I can see that because I think that Cox just loved his guys and felt that if they weren't getting a fair shake or what he perceived as one, that was just the sin of all sins. So he would start screaming at the umpires. But as I wrote a little bit the other day, he actually liked umpires as human beings.
Mm.
He didn't see them coming and say, "Oh, there's that so and so." No, he like, "Hey, buddy, how you doing?" And they'd say, "Hey, Bobby, how's it going?"
And they liked
And
him. Yeah.
oh yeah, yeah, and it was the same way. I mean, a lot of managers and coaches have very prickly ways around the press. Bobby loved the at least the writing part of the media.
Yeah.
He liked newspaper people and he liked sports writers. He was never crazy about TV because he didn't like being on TV a
Hmm.
whole lot.
You
But
could tell.
he loved being a writer. I mean,
Hmm.
writers were just all the writers would come into town, for the beginning of a homestand. They'd all come over and see Bobby. They called him Coxie. Hey, Coxie. Hey, Tracy. Hey, Jerry. How you doing? How's your team going? What's going on over there? And they would just talk baseball.
Hmm.
To see him around the ballpark was really, to say again, this is a man totally in his environment. He just loves this place. He wears the spikes because that's what you wear when you go to the ballpark.
Yeah. What other fun stories do you have and do you remember about him as a man, as a
I don't
player?
know. No, I don't have many more. I mean, there is one that Glavin and Maddox, Glavin or Maddox, one of them told at a Braves Hall of Fame dinner, I think, and that this was in 1990 when Bobby was still there, and that um, there was one thing that Bobby did not like from his players, and that was when they came to him and said, "What's my role on the team?" And so they were terrible that year. See, that was the shank of the 1990 season. They were coming back from West Coast. A guy who'd been just a relief pitcher. I'm not going to say his name, but he'd been a relief pitcher. He had had a bad outing out there or something, or he didn't get used on a road trip. They flew all night back, red eye, back to the Fulton County Stadium to where their cars were, and the players, they were talking on the plane. He was talking to some of the guys. Glavin would have been one of them, I think. And and the players were like in a interesting mood. The other pitchers were in an interesting mood, and they were saying, "Hey, you know what would be great is if you just go up to Bobby when we get back and say, 'Skip, I got to ask you something. What's my role on this team?'" And and so that actually happened. And he goes in, and Bobby, Mr. I Love Everybody, said, "You know when that phone rings down there in the bullpen, and I say, 'Get up and start throwing'? That's your freaking role right there. Now get out of here." So, and that was there. I'm sorry, I just remembered another thing too.
Good.
Um, they had a closer at one point. Not going to say his name either, but he was not he was not going well, and the job they were sort of they were experimenting with other ninth inning um relief, and he didn't like it, and he said to him on the airplane, they were getting on an airplane. Cox did some of his best work regarding flights, but he said. Um, he said, "What's my role?" And Bobby said, "Okay, that's it. You're off the team. You're not on the team anymore. You don't have a role." And Bobby picked up the Sky phone. You might remember those in planes back in the day
Yeah.
before,
Yeah.
yeah. He called Sherholtz and said, "Hey, I just cut so and so. Is that okay?" And cut Sherholtz said, "Okay by me." And so that was it.
That was the individual role on the team. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. He
So he
didn't
was,
like that one. That was that
uh-huh.
was that was his one. That was yeah.
You just had
So
to trust
that
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 he knew how to use you on the team.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 There was only one manager. So
Uh-huh.
I mean,
Yeah.
it
That's right.
wasn't a committee there. He was in charge. But yeah, that was those two were those two stories. Those are good ones.
Um, was it Bobby Cox as general manager who put together the trade when he traded Dale Murphy away? Was that him?
Think so. That was
Yeah.
1990.
Yep.
Was it? Yeah, I think it was. No, was it 90 or
I think it
89?
was. Yeah. I think it was 90. He traded him for a whole package of prospects, I think, 5 players or
Jeff
something like
Barrett was
that.
one of
Yeah.
them. A guy I covered, a pitcher who I covered when he was at Lafayette High School in
Who
Lexington,
was? I'm
Kentucky.
sorry. Say that again.
Jeff Parrott.
Jeff Parrott. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
He was a good guy. Didn't have a very long career, but he was a good guy.
Now, what I
And he was a
remember
pretty
is,
good basketball player too.
yeah,
Uh,
I remember that game where Tom Glavine, you may recall, brushed
oh,
Dale Murphy
where he threw
back
at him?
in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Phillies
Oh, that was
game.
great.
Yeah.
That
That
was
was sort of
91.
that
Yeah.
you're right. Yes, that was in early 91. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or maybe, yeah, it was pretty close there. And
hmm
that didn't pan out well for either side because
Yeah.
Murphy was never a very good player after that.
Yep.
But it was one of those that, it was coming up on the deadline. If you're going to trade Murphy, you're going to have to do it now. And, you know, it was sad. I remember going to the airport that day that Murphy caught the plane. I think it was to go to Philadelphia, and but it was yeah that was one of those that Bobby clearly didn't that the Braves did not want to do, but they felt like it was in their best interest to do it.
So you mentioned one time when we talked previously that now the Braves have had 4 managers in 36 years. Do you attribute that to Bobby Cox? Do you think that's
Well, given that he was there for 20, so yeah, I mean,
is that essentially his legacy? I guess is that kind of
well,
stability.
that's part of it. Yeah,
hmm
I think that is it four? Yeah, well, yeah, counting Weiss. Yeah, yeah, that's
Yep.
right. That's right.
Counting Walt. Yeah.
It was
Freddie
three. It
Gonzalez gets
was
lost in there,
three
right?
as
Yeah.
of last October.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah. When we
yeah,
talked, you pointed that out. It was only three in like 35,
yeah,
36 years. Amazing. Yeah.
yeah. Well, you know, they try to run it. They try not to be the Mets. Now
Yep.
they're never going to say that, but they try not to overreact to things. And
hmm
the fact is that, Bobby Cox had a run of 14 consecutive division titles and another playoff berth on his last year, uh, the wild card in 2010.
hmm
So, he made the playoffs a lot. And then, Freddie Gonzalez made him um, as a wild card and once as a division winner. But they didn't really like the direction things were headed in, and after things started to go bad in 2014 and into or I guess it was 2015. 14 was bad, 15 wasn't starting bad. Um, but that was at a time where the Braves had gone from they had fired Frank Wren and they'd gone from thinking of themselves as a contender to trying to dump everything in the pursuit of young pitching. So they were basically tanking,
Yeah.
and winning was secondary, and it was kind of it almost never happens that the manager at the beginning of a tank is the manager when the tank starts when the team finally pulls itself out because there's just too many L's stack up.
hmm
And that's what happened. And they brought in Brian Snitker and and then he got through the first two seasons and they weren't great seasons, but then um, they hung on to him in 20 after the 2017 season. And then they won six consecutive division titles and the World Series and finished and went to the playoffs 7 years in a row.
hmm
So, you know, you don't fire guys that are winning like that. So,
Yeah.
that it's, you know, it's kind of one of those things where, the best teams in college basketball, they have like two or three coaches over a 30-year period. Well, that's kind of what's happening here too.
Yeah. So how would you sum up at the end? Where do you place these two, Ted Turner and Bobby Cox, in Atlanta sports history
Well,
in Atlanta?
Turner was obviously so much bigger than sports. I
Yeah.
mean, he became a major player in Atlanta sports, but I mean, his legacy is always going to be CNN, I think. I
Mhm.
mean, the first news network, the first, people said he was nuts. Who's going to watch news all day around? What are you going to put on TV? What are you going to put
Yeah.
on in the middle of the night?
Hmm.
And and then but yeah, he Turner was, he won the America's Cup too. I mean, it wasn't like Ted Turner had no life apart. I mean,
Yeah.
he did a lot of amazing things. And I think that he was the guy though that sort of greenlit the Braves to go out and get guys when they started winning, and they asked Ted, "Do we have the money?" When Sherholtz and Cox went to him and said, "Do we have the money?" He said, "Yeah." Because if you remember when the Yankees and Braves met in the 1996 World Series, those were your two biggest spending teams
Mm-hmm.
because the Braves were the ones that had gone out and signed Maddox as a free agent. Uh, Probably the best pitching free agent ever. They almost got Barry Bonds that same winter meeting in
Mm.
Louisville, uh, the greatest free agent signing ever. And then of course they went out and traded for a guy like Fred McGriff who had a big contract. And they whatever shareholders needed to do, they were allowed to do. Now
Hmm.
that that sort of came down when Ted sold the team, and then when Liberty Media took over,
Yep.
uh, the payroll had came down. Although it's top 10 again. So and you can't look at this Braves team and think, oh, they don't have any talent there. I mean,
Yeah.
this is still a very, very talented team.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, Mark Bradley, I appreciate you coming on here again to share your
Sure.
memories of two Atlanta icons who have left us, and we'll get together
I
again.
have memories about one of them. I have many more memories about one than the other. I mean, I think I told you that my most memorable sighting of Ted Turner came at a Hawks game where he walked by with Raquel Welch.
that that's a great memory to have.
I paid attention. What can I say?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope you'll come on again, and we'll
Oh,
uh, we'll
anytime,
we'll
sir.
talk some more. My thanks to Mark Bradley for joining me on this podcast. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Crellin. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. If you're a fan of Today in Georgia History, and who isn't, check it out at the completely redesigned website at todayingeorgiahistory.org, and you can see it and hear it currently airing twice a day on TV and radio on Georgia Public Broadcasting. You can find this podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would like to ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, which would be most helpful and appreciated. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow, subscribe, and share with a friend. And drop me a line at sdeaton@georgiahistory.com. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. You can also treat yourself to every podcast, every blog, and every video entitled Dispatches from Off the Beaten Path at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.